Hey guys, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with another installment in my Vikings recommendation series, and today we're going to be talking all about the Anglo-Saxons. I hear you. You're automatically thinking, why are we talking about the Anglo-Saxons in a Viking series? Are they not English? Yes and no. The Anglo-Saxons, when we think of this term and when we think of these people, we are talking about the area that we now term England prior to 1066. 1066 comes in, we kind of switch over really from being Saxons to being more Norman oriented. A lot of bad things happened in the years following the Norman conquest to Saxon landowners. They were ousted, and eventually the designation Anglo-Saxon or Norman, it stopped meaning much of anything, and English came into the vocabulary. And another thing that I think is important to keep in mind when we're talking about the Anglo-Saxons is that they came to settle the area that we now call England. They did that in a very similar way to the Norse. And they came from a lot of Norse or Norse adjacent lands. You might have heard, specifically if you are from the UK, you've probably heard the term Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. These are three different people that eventually became known as the Anglo-Saxons, and the Angles lent their name to the country of England in general, Angleland, and eventually we just kind of transformed that and shortened it into England. The Angles are not a people that you hear very much about. But of course, the Saxons, you might can guess, came from an area in Germany that is called Saxony. There is still a Saxony in Germany today. The Jutes came from an area that is still called Jutland in modern day Denmark. The peninsula of Denmark is still called Jutland, and the people that came from there were called the Jutes. In the years following the fall of Rome, and in particular, the collapse of their infrastructure in Britain, which happened a lot sooner in Britain than it did in a lot of other areas in the empire, they pulled out of Britain around 410. The Eastern Roman Empire is thought to have ended around 476, 480. So the Roman infrastructures of roads, towns, walls, that all fell into disarray actually quite rapidly in Britain. And in this kind of vacuum of power, the Anglo-Saxons came over and took it over. Unfortunately, that's when you get into this term Dark Ages, because a lot of people will make the argument that right here after the fall of Rome, we enter the Dark Ages and we don't emerge until the Renaissance starts happening around 1400 in Italy. There's a lot of things wrong with that. The Dark Ages, and Dark Ages as a term originated because it means there's kind of a dearth of information from this period of time. And in some locations, such as Scotland, unfortunately, that is the case. But I hope that I'll show you today that it wasn't the case in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So the Anglo-Saxons come over, they occupy essentially the area that we now think of as modern England, and they separate into various kingdoms. There's a lot of legends about this Anglo-Saxon invasion, that it was violent, that they were hired as mercenaries and brought over to fight another people, to fight the Britons, that the Anglo-Saxons were the force that King Arthur was trying to fight when he united the Britons. If you believe him to be a historical person, that is an argument to be made. And then there is the argument that the Anglo-Saxons came over gradually, they came over sporadically. There is nothing in the archaeological record that makes the argument for a massive, violent invasion where they superseded the people that were there before. I think I kind of agree with this more sporadic approach where the average people who were living in the area that we term England, and for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to call it England. I know it wasn't called that at this time, but the people who were living in England at this time, they just kind of married into the Anglo-Saxon elite and were eventually superseded by them. So in the years post-Rome, we have a very murky period in England that is the late 400s, 500s, and early 600s. There truly is not a great deal we can know for sure about this time period unless we are looking at the archaeological record. But lucky for us, the 700s proved to be a little bit of a brighter period in this dark age. if you'll allow me that. I try not to use the term Dark Ages. I know it's fallen out of fashion, and I highly disagree with what it's trying to say and what it implies about the medieval period. But when I was in school, we did use the term Dark Age, and I know it's a little bit crass, so forgive me for that. But the 700s were a pretty great time. In terms of information, probably not for the people living. But in the 700s, we can really start to see the formation of the kingdoms that we now remember, and remember kind of fondly, as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So I'm going to insert a map right here of the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The four major ones that you probably know specifically from the Viking period would be Mercia, East Anglia, Northumbria, and the big one, Wessex, which was, in a way, the foundation of modern England. But on occasion, Kent was independent. Kent was independent until the late 700s, early 800s, if I'm remembering correctly. Essex and Sussex were also independent kingdoms for a time. But when we're talking about the Viking invasions and we're talking about the Viking Age, the four main kingdoms really were East Anglia, Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex. And all three but Wessex fell to the Vikings. Wessex eventually had its own problems. It was invaded by the Vikings, but it never fell, so to speak, in the days of Alfred the Great like the other kingdoms did. And so maybe you're still questioning, why are we talking so much about the Vikings' enemies in this Vikings recommendations video today? And so, yes, the Anglo-Saxons kind of came over as a seafaring people, and they came from Norse or Nordic adjacent homelands. But the Anglo-Saxons were very, very tied to the Vikings during the Viking Age, specifically in an area of the country that came to be known as the Danelaw. And the Danelaw existed for over 100 years. Had a lot of Danish settlers, a lot of people spoke Danish. And in fact, there have been studies done in this part of the country in England that citizens who live there now share a lot of DNA and genetic similarities to Scandinavians, more so than they do other British people, which is really, really interesting. If I can find that article, I will link to it down below. You will sometimes hear the Danelaw called the Five Boroughs. And so when you hear the Five Boroughs, they're talking about 5 cities. One of these is no longer a township, and that's Stamford. You will know Stamford from the Battle of Stamford Bridge, which actually was the ending of the Viking Age. Most people consider the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, immediately prior to the Battle of Hastings. They consider this to be the end of the Viking Age. Another reason to tie the Anglo-Saxons to the Vikings. Then you have Lincoln, Derby, Nottingham, and Leicester. These 5 were the 5 boroughs. There was actually a Danish king of England named Canute. He was the king of Denmark and of England at the same time. There was a lot of Danish or Norse presence in England up until 1066. The Battle of Stamford Bridge ended the Viking Age in more ways than one. It ended Norse and Danish activity, in particular in England itself. There were a couple of other raids that happened post 1066, and Scotland in particular continued to see activity from the Norse into the 1100s. I mean, there are 100 different things to say here. The Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings interacted so deeply that they were really entwined during this period. If you were a citizen of any of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, you would have been really, really familiar with Norse activity. You might even have been familiar with their language, which is an interesting thing to think about. So really, the Anglo-Saxons are some of the Vikings' enemies who were the closest to them, not only genetically, but they were the closest to them in that they saw a lot of Norse activity across this 300-year span, and they saw it quite consistently. So what I have for you today is a lot of nonfiction, mostly primary source nonfiction, actually, which is really interesting. I didn't think that my list would be mostly compiled of this, but obviously we can get one out of the way first. Read The Last Kingdom by Bernard Cornwell. If you want to get a handle on this period of time and you really just want to experience it in a fictional way and through historical fiction, you can't get any better than this. I love this series. I recommend it in every video in this Vikings recommendation series, but if you haven't picked it up and you're curious, you want to learn more, but you're a little bit intimidated by nonfiction and you're intimidated in particular by the names, I understand that. Definitely give this series a shot. Another source that I talk about quite frequently in this series, so I won't stay on it long, is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. I've talked about this at length before, especially in my most recent video in this series about Ragnar and his sons. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is one of the main sources that we have for them historically. A lot survives in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. We should be really, really thrilled that we have this as a source. And one of the major Old English poems survives in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. That's the Battle of Brunanburh, which I have just recently learned is pronounced Brunanburh. I've always thought it was Brunanburh or something like that. But the Battle of Brunanburh, really, this is something if you wanted to take a time machine back to the Middle Ages and you wanted to see one battle, this would be it for me. The Battle of Brunanburh saw at least 4 kings on the battlefield, and a lot of people say this is the most important battle fought by the Saxons, other than Hastings, and obviously that's an easy argument to make because 1066 is always going to rate quite highly for a lot of people. But the Battle of Brunanburh really started to set boundaries that we now think of. It set kind of the Welsh borders. It also started to set the border between England and Scotland. It's a really interesting battle, and mostly it is preserved through this poem. And the Anglo-Saxons had a lot of great poetry because you also have The Wanderer, which is an anonymous poem. The Battle of Brunanburh is also written anonymously, as the majority of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was. But most Old English poetry was written anonymously. That was just a stylistic choice. Most people did not attach their names to this. The Wanderer is a really excellent poem, but it has gone on to kind of create this stereotype that people in the Dark Ages were daft. Because I believe it is The Wanderer where there's this line about Roman ruins, and the narrator of this poem believes these ruins couldn't have been left by men. They had to have been left by giants. And so people just have always taken this to mean that medieval people had no memory and no recollection of what the Romans did, and obviously they were dumb and dirty and medieval peasants. And this is an attitude that goes back to the Renaissance. And that's something I will take on another day. But y'all know I'm the queen of loving the medieval period, so I don't slam that here. But The Wanderer is a really excellent poem. There are a lot of Norse influences in The Wanderer. There are some Norse influences in the Battle of Brunanburh too, but you would see that probably most specifically in Beowulf. And I'm sure there are people who wondered why I didn't include Beowulf when I talked about the Norse sagas and when I talked about Scandinavian sources on this period in time. But Beowulf is an Anglo-Saxon poem, and it's written in Old English. It's, of course, about Beowulf, about the slaying of Grendel, and then the slaying of Grendel's mother. And it's written very much in a style that echoes the Norse saga, because Beowulf himself is actually what we would nowadays term Danish. He's from an area of the country that is now modern-day Denmark. At the time, it would have been more recognizably independent. So it's interesting to think, why would an Anglo-Saxon writer have written a poem focusing on a Norse hero? But their poetry is really one of the best ways we have to connect with the Anglo-Saxons, to see what was something that they valued, the morals that they wanted to impart. This is definitely a story and a style of writing that would have been told orally. Beowulf is definitely like that. The Wanderer, the Battle of Brunanburh, they all echo songs. And so that's something that would have been part of their culture. It is to go and hear the Skald come around and tell the story of the great King Athelstan at the Battle of Brunanburh. Tell me the story of Beowulf slaying the dragon. Tell me the story of the Wanderer, who was an exile. This is a story of a man who is exiled and laments leaving his lord's hall. So there are a lot of great Old English poems. Get yourself a good translation. A lot of people seem to think that Shakespeare wrote in Old English. Sadly, no, he did not. Shakespeare wrote in modern English. Chaucer wrote in Middle English. The poet who wrote Beowulf was writing in Old English. I am telling you right now, if, again, we were to step back in time and we wanted to have a conversation with Alfred the Great, we could not do it. We could not understand each other. Old English is absolutely a foreign language to the modern English ear and to the modern English eye. When you're trying to read it, it's something that can be done. Don't get me wrong. It is something that can be done. But you definitely want a good translation of Beowulf, and there are several that do this where they put the Old English on one side, the modern English on the other, and then you will see just how different they are and how far English as a language has evolved. Moving on to some histories written during this period and immediately after, we have to talk about Bede, the Venerable Bede. Bede's ecclesiastical history of the English people is one of the most important works written during this period of time. It's the reason why we have so much information about the Anglo-Saxon period, especially the earlier Anglo-Saxon period. Bede lived from the late 600s to the early mid 700s, and this was his history of Christian churches all across England. And so you get his perspective on a lot of different things in a wide variety of places in the land that we now call England. It's a key work of Anglo-Saxon history, and it's also a work that helped to define some of the national identity of the English. It's a really fascinating work, and it's actually immensely readable. You would think for something published in the 700s that it would not be approachable at all, but it definitely is. But it's not as much fun as this next one that we're going to talk about, which is Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. This right here is much of the basis of King Arthur. It's also a lot of the basis for Merlin. This is pseudo-historical. This is genuinely not a historical source. It was written in the 1100s, so post-Saxon period, but it was talking about sort of the history of the kings of Britain from a very early period, including potential settlement by the Trojans fleeing the Greeks after the Trojan War, and this is a very popular origin story for a lot of countries, but it's certainly not historically accurate, specifically in the case of England, but it's never historically accurate elsewhere. This is just a popular origin story, but he tells that story up to a certain point in the Anglo-Saxon period, early Anglo-Saxon period. I don't think he ever touches what we consider the Viking Age. This was considered historical fact and a historical source probably until the 1500s. Then it started to be questioned. Now no one views it as factual at all, which in its own way is sad because it certainly has a story-like quality to it, and it makes you want to believe that what he's telling you is the truth, but it's not. Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain is a wild ride, and it's something that you should just read for enjoyment. Another thing you can read that I will link to down below is Boethius. Now, Boethius is most famous for writing the Consolation of Philosophy, and maybe just by my saying of his name, which I'm probably pronouncing incorrectly, you are assuming that this is a Roman dude. You'd be right. Boethius lived right around the time that we typically think the Eastern Roman Empire fell. A lot of people argue 476 is the year that the Roman Empire officially fell in the East, but some people will date that to around 480 with the death of the last emperor. And so Boethius was born in 480, essentially. And so he lived into the 500s. He lived under Theodoric the Great, which is another interesting link to the Vikings, because Theodoric and Attila the Hun feature quite prominently in one of the most famous Norse sagas of all time, Volsunga Saga, the Saga of the Volsungs. They are under more Norse or Germanic type names. I think Attila is just called Atli, but Theodoric has something entirely different. But Theodoric was the king in Italy and was the king of the Ostrogoths in Italy after the fall. But Boethius was a Roman, and he focused a lot on philosophy. And this is his most famous work, The Consolation of Philosophy, and it's a conversation between himself and a personified version of philosophy, which takes the form of a woman. And essentially throughout this, he argues that even though there's a lot of imperfection and a lot of strife in the world, there is a higher power, and everything is secondary to that higher power. So this was an instrumental work in early Christianity, and particularly in the medieval period. Boethius was very, very popular throughout the 1,000 years of the medieval period. He also coined the term the Wheel of Fortune, which was a popular metaphor in the Middle Ages for the way history moves. One day you're on top of the wheel, the next day you're thrown right back down. The Wheel of Fortune is used quite a bit. Actually, in the later medieval period, it's very, very popular. But Boethius was extremely popular at this period of time. So popular, in fact, that Alfred the Great translated him into Old English. Alfred the Great spent a lot of his life translating classic works and just translating works in general into Old English. He was really paving the way for the English Bible. He wanted that. Alfred the Great was an incredibly learned man, and I could go on and on and on about him. I already have. Check out my Alfred the Great recommendations video if you want to know more about him and you want more specific recommendations for him. But you can read his translation of Boethius online. It's very interesting. Boethius is actually not a Roman that we think of quite often nowadays. I would say that most people probably haven't even heard of him. But he was somebody who had a great deal of popularity prior to the Renaissance because he was a big religious thinker and he was a philosopher that survived the fall of Rome. And perhaps that was why he was someone who lived immediately post the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, and so his stuff never got lost to the sands of time like so many other Roman philosophers did. But speaking of Alfred, a little overlap here from my Alfred the Great video is Alfred the Great's biography by Asser. This was written for Alfred the Great and about him by a member of his court, the Bishop Asser, who was a Welsh monk. He came and he lived at this court. He wrote this during Alfred's lifetime, and so you can imagine there's some bias in it, but it's absolutely fascinating, and this version also has some things that Alfred translated. This goes hand in hand with Bede and Geoffrey of Monmouth in that it is trying to be an early historical work. So this is just an interesting source on this time period, and it's giving you a blow-by-blow of everything that's happening. It's kind of wild. It's really kind of fun to be something that was written in the 800s, similar to Bede. And I think that you can really enjoy it, especially if you have a curiosity for this time period and for what was going on during the Viking Age in Wessex. In terms of modern nonfiction, I would definitely recommend Max Adams. This is Alfred's Britain, but he has a couple of other books in a so-called trilogy. This is the last in that trilogy. I think he has The King in the North and In the Land of Giants, which are both chronicling an earlier period of Anglo-Saxon history. This is, of course, very relevant to the Viking series because Alfred's Britain was one that was rapidly changing. I really like Max Adams. I think he's very readable. I think his scholarship is good, and I just highly recommend this book. I highly recommend all three in this so-called trilogy, and I hope that he plans on coming out with more focusing on this period of time. If you have read any of these, please let me know. If you're someone who's into the Anglo-Saxons, I would also love to know that down below. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.